My Italian fantasy. Well, that was the start to the whole trip, wasn't it? We decided after my retirement I wanted to do more traveling. And I'd never been to Italy. And I did have a bit of a fantasy about what it might look like, that we would be drinking lovely cups of espresso cappuccino in the morning. And maybe, although I'm not sure I wanted to do this, but it was part of my fantasy, ride around in a Vespa on our trip. And we didn't ride a Vespa, but the big surprise was we didn't have a whole lot of lovely cups of cappuccino. We had some espresso in the tiniest cups we've ever seen. Tasty, but very small. I had never been to Italy, and I had a problem actually when we planned this trip because I always wanted to see Italy. I wanted to eat pasta. That was the other important part of the fantasy, and we did eat lots of good pasta. But I had a worry, and my worry was, after having spent so much time in Paris, Paris had a really important place in my heart, and I thought, how am I going to find another country and city to love as much? And as it turned out, that was not a problem. Where did we go in Italy? We started in Florence. I had never seen anything like the marble work on the outside of Il Duomo. I thought that was really remarkable. We had some nice dinners there. Leah joined us there. We went to the Uffizi, the largest art museum / gallery that I've ever been in. It was like one continuous gallery. It was really quite something. And we spent some time in a beautiful garden one afternoon. We were a little early for Wisteria, but the view back at the city was wonderful. We had an apartment with a fabulous rooftop terrace on it. And what was amazing about that was that we were eye to eye, we were on eye level with the top of Il Duomo, with the dome on top of Il Duomo. And we could just sit there and enjoy that view over a beautiful meal, which we did. And that was lovely. It was just a lovely way to start the trip. Where did we go after Florence? We went to Metato, up in Tuscany, in the northwest corner of Tuscany, very close to the Ligurian Sea. But arriving in Metato was amazing. I don't remember ever going up a mountain as steeply as we did. And I do remember giving Mark, who was driving the car, a very hard time because I thought literally we were going to fall off the mountain. To speak to my Italian fantasy, I'm looking up, I said, where are we going up this mountain? And he pointed up to a small, tiny, a village is a generous word, up on the side of the mountain. And the other part of my fantasy for my fantasy vacation was that I was going to be able to walk around. And I kept looking up going, there's no way I'm going to fall off the mountain the minute we set foot out of this car, unless somebody literally scotch tapes me to the side of this mountain. And I was panicking. We had this hair-raising drive full of hairpin turns, and we got all the way to the top of the mountain, to the base of where we were going to stay, this little walled section of the village. And once we finally were parked and we could get out of the car, and I found that I did not fall down the mountain, that was such a relief. It was so beautiful because There were rosemary bushes. I guess it's not fair to call them a bush, but just rosemary plantings all along the wall, spilling down. I don't know, they must have cascaded 15 feet. And when we got there, it was early April. It was wildflower and herb season. Everything was in flower. The rosemary was all in flower. It was so beautiful. The grounds in Metato had any number of sheltered places to sit and enjoy the view. And pools. There was a bathing pool with cascades of water. It was so pretty. And the Burgo was like the little burg of Metato that this architect had designed. Had about, at the time we were there, about 7 apartments. We were given to understand that sometimes he would take down a wall and make 6 apartments. Sometimes he'd add a wall and make 8. But they were simply and beautifully decorated. And we had the most amazing outdoor space to eat, sit, and enjoy the view. And down one terrace from our beautiful porch area was a hot tub. And we were able to sit in the hot tub, watch the sunset, and enjoy the most incredible view of the Ligurian Sea as the sun came down behind it, drinking Aperol spritzes, which was just such fun. Metato is the name of some small outdoor sheds that are used to dry chestnuts, so that this was an area where chestnuts were harvested as well. The area around the villa was surrounded by old vineyards, a lot of olive groves. So that was quite fun, and we took a lot of really wonderful walks around there. The mountains came right up behind us, and Mark and Leah and Felipe were able to hike up to the top of those mountains. Oh, the inside of the house was just beautiful. It was all done in grays and whites. I mean, it was sort of, I don't know if I'd call it rustic Italian country. I don't know if I have enough experience with other spots to say that's what it is, but it was just so relaxing. And the kitchen was definitely sort of rustic country, but it had everything we needed. Lots of old pots and pans and an older stove. And it was the perfect place to have a cooking class. A woman who works locally, I think maybe as a chef, came in and spent 4 hours with us making a meal that included maltagliati, which is pasta that's just very roughly rolled out. So tasty. Made that at home since. Scarpaccio. Scarpaccio is shoe leather. And that was just zucchini and zucchini blossoms, a little bit of onion flour, put out in a pan with olive oil and baked. And I've made that as well since. So yummy. Those were 2 of my favorite parts of the meal. We also did a cake at the end. Then there was the rabbit stew, which was very delicious. You can tell I remember the other 2 things first. But the rabbit stew was yummy. And we had our Italian grandma chef, and then we had this lovely young woman who was the daughter of the architect who designed the whole burg. She translated for us, and we had to make a few adjustments. She had given us the recipe on some beautiful Italian sort of grass paper. She got some of the you could tell that all of the recipes were, that the chef kind of knew them. They, weren't written down. But after gauging some of the amounts that she put into these recipes, our translator had to make some adjustments for us in the recipes that we took home. But the other thing that we did not cook that day, that the Italian grandma chef had made, and you could purchase anytime you liked in this fabulous little cave storage area. Remember that? Where she had the most amazing cookies called cantucci. So good. And those, it turns out, actually both the scarpaccio and the cantucci are very local. The recipes for them are specific to the towns and the areas that they're from. So in trying to recreate this carpaccio at home and the contucci, I've had to look at any number of recipes and then sort of circle back around to what we did. And fortunately, we have great video from that session. So I don't know why I didn't do it the first time I recooked some of those dishes, but I did the second time to go back and see exactly what she'd done. So yummy, simple, yummy. We had some very enchanting but disruptive neighbors in Metato because the architect and his family kept donkeys on the property. They wander mostly in a fenced-in area, but they get loose every once in a while. And one day we had gone off on an adventure and Felipe stayed home to do Zoom meetings. And at some point in the day, as he was out on the terrace Zooming and facing the house, his fellow Zoomers got all excited because the donkeys had come right up behind him and disrupted his meeting. He had to bolt and go into the house. And then all day long in all the subsequent meetings, people had heard about the donkeys, our neighbors, the disruptive donkeys. But at least everybody had something interesting to talk about, even if they didn't get as much work done as maybe they could have. Metato was located up at the far northwest corner of Tuscany. And I keep remembering more parts of the Italian fantasy, but I have had, since my honeymoon, I've had ceramics that come from Italy. And they come from towns in and around the area of Siena, the town of Siena. And that is in the heart of classic Tuscany, which has the big cypresses and the rolling hills and the vineyards. And Metato, on the other hand, was very rugged and mountainous. So the terrain felt very different. And it was so beautiful, I didn't give it too much thought until we did finally get down to Siena and go into shops with the most fantastic array of ceramics and the beautiful colors and styles and this very different terrain, a more gentle rolling terrain. And we were able to visit some of the vineyards in Tuscany when we went to Siena. There were other places that we went to also while we were staying, either while we were at Metato or while we made our way down towards Rome. We went to a number of small, very old towns, some of which didn't look terribly different than they did in the 1500s. So many of these towns were famous for their towers. One of them was San Gimignano. And I think San Gimignano was remarkable in that it had many of them still intact. I think of that part of our trip as the Assassin's Creed tour of Italy, because that was, I hope I don't get this wrong, but maybe the birthplace of Enzo. Ezio. Not Enzo. The birthplace of Ezio, Felipe's alter ego. And as we made our way through San Gimignano, possibly Rome and Florence as well, Felipe would say, I think I've been here before. Or if we went left, or if we could just go over that wall, it would be so much more direct to get to where we want to go. And then we started asking, has Felipe been here? Or has Ezio been here? And then after a few stops on our trip, we started thinking of it as the Assassin's Creed tour of Italy, which is very fun. We visited San Gimignano, and we also visited Montereggiano. Montereggione. Let's get back in my Italian head here. Montereggione, which had a central plaza, as I remember it, a wall that you could walk around so that you could sort of view the surrounding areas. Beautiful views of that classic Tuscany landscape with the trees and the rolling hills. So that was very fun. That was a really nice trip that day. Before we left Tuscany, we did visit Poggio Antico. We've enjoyed wine from Poggio Antico in the past at home, and so we wanted to go to where it's made, where the grapes are grown. And we were, at this point in the trip, in 2 cars because Mike had arrived and he rented a car in Florence. When we drove to Poggio Antico, Mike and I were in one car, and Leah and Mark and Felipe were in the other car, and we got there after much winding around the mountain, going up the switchbacks, and we wondered where the other car was, where Leah and Mark and Felipe were. And after about 20 minutes, we called them because we had a tour and a time that we were supposed to be there. And it turned out that Poggio Antico has more than one vineyard. And one of them is not in Tuscany, but in Umbria. And Leah and Mark and Felipe had gone to Umbria. So they sadly missed the very lovely tour of Poggio Antico, but they had some great adventures of their own while they were in Umbria.
Su le finestre mostra tutto il mio cuore che hai acceso. Chiudo dentro me la luce che hai incontrato per strada. Con te partirò, paesi che non ho mai veduto e vissuto con te, adesso sì li vivrò con te, partirò. Per mari che io lo so, no, non esistono più, con te io li rivivrò, con te partirò.
Oh my God, how could I not remember this? A bobblehead thing? A bobblehead thing? What did I buy? Oh, the duck! The duck! The duck was a dancing duck. It was a dancing duck that sat on the dashboard for the rest of the trip and kept us entertained when the road got long. The dancing duck. After Metato, we made our way south to Rome.
Strappan
We drove into Rome. Rome is tricky traffic-wise, and after a few misturns, we got to the Airbnb, unloaded all the luggage out of the 2 cars, and quickly Mike and Mark went to return those cars. And in the, 45 minutes, maybe 2 hours that we had cars in Rome, we managed to accumulate tickets, which didn't show up for months. And then they were not exactly the kind of reminder of Italy you wanted to get in the mail, but there they were. Very tricky driving in Rome. The Airbnb in Rome was like going home to an art museum. It was covered in paintings. The doors, the sliding doors had paintings. The walls had paintings. There was large statuary. There was a statue. It was a woman, but still arms like this. And every single time I walked into my bedroom, I would think somebody was in the hall, and I would startle. But there were some very large, ornate, almost like traffic lights, and they were quite eye-catching. You came into the apartment almost on a stairway. It was a little landing, and then you had to come up a steep flight of stairs, and at the head of it, I think maybe on each landing, there was a beautiful painting. But on your left was a whole glass wall of windows where you could look back out onto that courtyard. I think we spent a lot of time, I know I took the time to film that space, that apartment, because it was just so rich in things to see. And each of us had different painting in our rooms. Ours was so ornate, and I think the whole was either like almost like a screen was painted behind the bed, and then there was a screen that was used to close the bedroom off from a sitting room with velvet couches, and again, more statuary and artwork and old furniture. It was remarkable. It was absolutely remarkable. And also it had a terrace, another rooftop terrace, with a view of the Forum, of the oldest part of Rome, which had been excavated over the last 100 years, I guess. Very beautiful backdrop to the wonderful dinners that Mark cooked us there. It was a very quiet little street, but when you came off that street and you had a view, you were right on top of the old ruins. And there was also a little church, I think, around the corner, around the block. And we didn't really know about that church until one night we were sitting on the terrace, and there was this lovely little procession of lights coming down and some music playing. And we dropped what we were doing because we had to follow. What was this parade? We had to find out. And it was in memoriam, I don't think it was of a saint necessarily, was it? But of somebody that this church honored in some way. And we got to see this beautiful little procession and listen to the music. And it had stopped, I think, by the time we found our way to the church, and lots of people holding candles in front of this tiny little church. It was very wonderful. I love the food in Rome. A highlight of our eating tour of Italy was a restaurant called Alla Ora, I think, which I have since recommended to quite a number of people. I'm not sure anybody has made it yet because you really have to reserve early there, and Mark did a very good job of that for us. So we had a reservation at the restaurant Alla Ora. And what I remember the most is there were at least 2 courses where they really brought the food out, tiny bites, and set a tableau. And there were a lot of plays on words. There was the tiny bit of pasta, which was done alla dente as opposed to al dente, served on a tooth. There was a tiny merry-go-round. There was a dessert that came on a merry-go-round, and there was a tiny little bite of something sweet. We had like a mushroom soup that looks like a cappuccino. There was another dish, I think one of the desserts came on a hand. I don't know where they got that hand. It was like something that you might see if you were modeling gloves. If you were a company selling gloves, you might have had a hand like that. And there were 3 beautiful desserts presented on top. Each dish was so beautifully prepared and presented, but every bite was delicious. We went to the Vatican. We went twice. We toured the Vatican Museum, which has an extensive and impressive collection of artwork. And we went back to Vatican City a second time because we decided we wanted to see the view of Rome, the famous view of Rome from the top of St. Peter's Basilica. And the line was deceptively short. It looked like it was short, and it turned out to be really long. But it was worth the wait, and when we finally got to go up to the top of the basilica, some of us, we split up, some of us walked all the way to the top, some of us took an elevator, and when you came out of the elevator, that'd be Mike and me, you're at the base of the dome, and then you still have to make your way up a spiral staircase all the way to the top, and by the time you get to the top of the dome, you have to lean over to the side because the dome is curved and there's only this much space for you, and the space is curved as well. It was quite a relief to get to the top of the dome and see the view spread out before us. And you really can see, you could see all of the 7 hills of Rome. You could see, get a really good view of what the private space, not inside obviously, but where the Pope lives. And then you could just see out onto the whole city of Rome, sort of spread out in front of you. So worth the climb. And I think the descent was the same way. You had to come back down the way you'd come. A little claustrophobic, but very impressive. I remember St. Peter's Square as being, it's a very large area. And there was something going on, I think, when we were there. There were chairs set up in the front for dignitaries to watch. Oh, it might have even been the Pope's Sunday address. I remember it being big and open. I remember we saw some Swiss guards there towards the edges when we were waiting to go in. And they were very impressive as well. Lots of columns, lots of statuary.
Goodbye, goodbye to Rome, city of a million moonlit faces, city of a million warm embraces, where I found the one of all the faces, far from home. Arrivederci Roma. It's time for us to part. Save the wedding bells for my returning. Keep my lover's arms outstretched and yearning. Please be sure the flame of love keeps burning in her heart. Arrivederci Roma. Save the wedding bells for my returning. Keep my lover's arms outstretched and yearning. Please be sure the flame of love keeps burning. Please
The timing of this trip, the reason that we went in April of 2022 was to celebrate my retirement. In March of 2020, the pandemic hit. The science center where I worked shut its doors almost immediately because we were a very public-facing institution. Management of the Science Center called us in one by one, and when they came to me, they said, we're not laying you off, we're going to have you working from home. So I did not ask to retire at that moment. It just seemed wrong. And we got all of the way through 2020, still shut down. I wrote a lot of grants. I might have made it all the way to 2021, actually, because at the end of that year, I did officially retire. We had a party on Zoom for me because no one was back in person yet. And then I more or less retired. And maybe it was still the following year before we got to Italy, before the world was healthy enough to travel again. So it was an interesting time to travel, but particularly rewarding because we were able to have a really tremendous time together. In addition to my retirement being prompted by my need to be able to have more flexibility to go down and see my dad, who's in his 90s, and needed, after being locked down during the pandemic for a very long time, needed company and family around him. And in addition to needing the time to be able to do that, I had one child in Europe, in France, and then the other one in Washington State. So a 5-hour flight, really more, 8 or 9 hour, 10-hour trip to the west to see Leah, 8-9 hour trip to the east to see Mark, 5-hour trip to the south to see Dad. So a big part of what my retirement is about is being able to have the flexibility to travel to my family. And I am a person who accumulates memories, many of which are wrapped up in things and photos. And my other big hope for my retirement is to be able to organize those things. It's ephemera. It's called the ephemera, that my house is full of, photos in particular, in such a way that my kids and maybe family down the line can enjoy and be able to share. And that's going to take some work too. So those are all things I have in mind for this next phase in my life. I love to travel. I always have. I did a lot more of it when I was younger. Stopped for quite a while when my kids were young because I, unlike other people, I couldn't manage it traveling with young children. And we had a lot of other things that demanded our time and our resources when the kids were little. But I loved traveling when I was younger. I love languages. I speak one or two, but love hearing all of the polyglot of languages that is travel in Europe and elsewhere. I love tasting new foods. I love being in new places. I love seeing new things. I think a lot about the ambiance on the street of European cities. I made a trip to Paris while the pandemic was still very much affecting the world, but Paris had started to open up and the street cafes had come back, and we have some other family in Paris as well, and I stayed with my cousin David, and we were out walking one night. And he said he stopped to listen to the sound. And it was the sound of voices, just not ecstatically happy, but just normal voices and talking and chatter and people enjoying each other's company and a slight clatter of dinnerware and cups and glasses underneath that. And they echo in a particular way off of piazzas and small streets. And he said to me that sound went away during the pandemic. And it had just started to come back. And I thought that was just a remarkable commentary on how the world had changed and was hopefully beginning to revert. We hadn't all been able to spend time together in a very long time. Mark had come home during the pandemic, but we hadn't really seen Leah in a very long time, and it was really wonderful to have the whole family together and to have Felipe with us and to really get to spend that kind of quality time, having adventures, making memories in a very special place that I've always wanted to go to. So that became my retirement trip. Everyone should do something to celebrate their retirement, that change in life. And that was a pretty darn good way to do it, I have to say. And we're excited to see what comes next.
Quando sono solo e sogno all'orizzonte, manca le parole. Sì, lo so che non c'è luce in una stanza quando manca il sole. Se non ci sei tu con me, su le finestre. Mostra a tutti il mio cuore che hai acceso, chiudi dentro me la luce che hai incontrato per strada.
Pretend you're having a good time. It's not the right moment. What are you doing?
I was telling you, welcome into the temple of God. A tiny bit of a temple because of this light and shade. Because of this.
My office.
Yeah.
What are you doing on your computer? So type 1 fun. It's fun when you're doing it.
Don't let the truth get the
We love you anyway, man.
It's a little cold.
It's in here, it's really not cold.
Is it?
What a day for a picnic.
Leave the camera here and go.
We have 4. Good luck with that. Hey, I'm doing the movie. We have secretaries.
See, I get tired of it. I don't want to show you. It's that one place downtown that has it, but they never changed it. It should change it.
Press the button. Oh, I hit the record button.
I should have Shazammed it. It's okay. Rosing!